Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
I work the night shift at a 24-hour call center. It's a quiet job. Most of the calls I get are from insomniacs, graveyard shift workers, or people dealing with emergencies that aren't quite serious enough for 911. That night, the floor was nearly empty, just me, two other agents a few rows away, and our sleepy-eyed supervisor in her glass-walled office. I had just refilled my coffee and was about to clock back in when my screen lit up with an incoming call. No caller ID. I sighed and put on my headset. "Thank you for calling. How can I assist you?" And pause. Then a voice, not robotic, not distorted, but rugged, like it had been recorded and played back at a fraction of a second delay. "Hello," I swallowed. "Oh, hello, how can I help?" The voice hesitated. "You sound awake." I let out an awkward chuckle. "Well, yeah, it's my job to be." Silence again, just long enough for discomfort to settle in. Then, "You shouldn't be here." Something in the pit of my stomach twisted. "Excuse me, you should not be here. You should have left already." I glanced at the time. 3:12 a.m. My shift ended at 5. Sorry, I don't understand. Date your things. Leave now." A chill ran through me. I looked toward my supervisor's office, but the lights were off. I hadn't even noticed her leave. The two other agents, their desks were empty. I hadn't heard them leave. I stood up, heart pounding, scanning the room. The floor was deathly quiet, but the phone line was still open. I could hear something on the other end now, not breathing, not static, but the sound of my own voice. A second behind, like an echo. "Who is this?" I demanded. The voice finally changed. It became mine. "I already told you." It said, "You should have left." The call ended, and then the power cut out. The office was thrown into darkness. The emergency lights flickered on, dim and sickly yellow. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the exit, but the glass doors wouldn't budge. I slammed against them. "Hello, anyone?" The security desk was empty. Then, behind me, the sound of a chair rolling. I turned back to the office floor. Every single headset was lifted off its cradle, hanging just above the desks, as if someone invisible was holding them. And then, one by one, they dropped. Click, click, click. I don't remember screaming, but I must have. The next thing I knew, I was outside, gasping for air in the parking lot. The sky was turning gray with dawn. My supervisor called me later, confused why I left early. She swore the other agents had been there the whole night, that the power never went out, that the security guard never saw me leave. I checked the call logs. There was no record of that last call. I quit that night. I wish I could say I never thought about that night again, that I packed up, found another job, and moved on. But some things don't let go so easily. For weeks after I quit, I kept waking up at exactly 3:12 a.m. no matter how exhausted I was. My eyes would snap open, my breath caught in my throat like I had been yanked from sleep. There was no noise, no nightmares, just the suffocating feeling that someone was waiting for me to realize they were there. The first few times, I convinced myself it was stress. That night had rattled me, and my brain was just working through it. But then, the call started. My phone would buzz at 3:12 a.m. no caller ID. I never answered. I didn't want to, but the messages, I couldn't stop those. At first, they were blank, just empty voicemails, nothing but silence. Then, little noises crept in, a chair creaking, fingers tapping against a desk, a faint shuffle of movement. And then, one night, a message that made my skin crawl. "You left too soon." I blocked the number. It didn't help. The calls kept coming, always from no caller ID, always at 3:12 a.m. So I changed my number. For a week, it was quiet. I started to believe it was over. Maybe whatever had latched onto me had given up. Then, one night, as I was scrolling through my new phone, something made my stomach drop. Like call history, a single entry from no caller ID. 3:12 a.m. My blood turned to ice. I hadn't heard a ring. There was no voicemail, no notification, just a log sitting there like a stain I couldn't wash out. And then my screen flickered. For half a second, my reflection in the black screen of my phone wasn't mine. I dropped it like it burned. That was the last straw. The next morning, I packed up and drove 4 states away. New city, new apartment, new everything. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. And then a week later, I was unpacking when I found it, my old headset, the one from the call center. I swear I threw it away. I know I did. But there it was, coiled neatly in my new bedroom, like it had been waiting. I stared at it, my hands shaking. My breath came shallow, and I swear I could hear something, a faint, distant click, a headset being lifted. I never touched it. I grabbed it with a towel, stuffed it in a plastic bag, and dumped it in the nearest dumpster. That night, I slept with the lights on. I kept my phone powered off, refusing pausing to check the time, and for the first time since it all started, there was no call, no messages, just silence. I thought maybe, just maybe, it was finally over. Then, last night, as I was walking to my car, I passed by a late-night convenience store. The clerk inside was wearing a headset, and as I glanced at him through the window, he suddenly froze. His eyes went wide, locked onto something behind me. His mouth opened, lips forming silent words. Leave. No. I didn't answer. I didn't move. The clerk inside the store was still staring, his lips forming the same silent word. Leave. My hand trembled as I pulled my phone from my pocket. The screen glowed in the dim street light, and I could feel my pulse in my fingertips as I stared at the call. No caller ID. 3:12 a.m. The buzzing stopped. Then, new voicemail. A sick feeling twisted in my stomach. I knew I shouldn't listen. I knew that whatever was on that recording, it wasn't going to help me. But my thumb moved before I could stop it. Play. At first, silence. Then, a soft, steady click. Click, click, click. Like headsets being placed down or lifted. Then, a whisper. But it wasn't just one voice. It was many, faint, overlapping, like an entire floor of people speaking in hushed tones, just out of reach. Then, a shift and breath. And then, my own voice. I already told you, it whispered, you should have left. My blood went cold. I ripped the phone from my ear, my breathing ragged. I didn't even think. I turned and ran. I barely registered the convenience store clerk pounding on the window, his face pale as he watched me flee. I sprinted to my car, hands fumbling with the keys as I threw myself inside and locked the doors. The parking lot was empty. I was alone, or so I thought, because as I sat there, chest heaving, phone clutched in my shaking hands, I heard something in the backseat. Not a voice, a headset clicking on. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Instead, I did the only thing I could think to do. I grabbed my phone and called someone, anyone, just to drown out the sound. I called myself. It rang once, twice, then someone answered, but it wasn't me. A voice came through the speaker, calm, quiet, familiar. You're awake. It said, good, now we can begin. The line went dead. This happened when I was 17 in a small town in upstate New York. My best friend, Cassie, and I had a weird hobby. We liked exploring old buildings. Not exactly urban explorers, more like bored teens looking for something creepy to do. One night, we decided to check out the abandoned church on the edge of town. It had been closed for decades, but nobody ever tore it down. The stained glass was broken in most of the windows, the front door was boarded up, and the town pretty much ignored it. We went in through a busted side door. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and old fabric. Pews were still lined up, though a lot had collapsed into piles of rot. The altar was still there, and behind it was a huge, towering organ covered in dust. It was quiet, except for the occasional sound of the wind slipping through broken windows. We wandered for a bit, mostly joking around, until Cassie noticed something weird, a single, perfectly new candle sitting in the middle of the altar. It wasn't melted, no dust on it, just, someone's been here, I said. Cassie was about to say something back when we heard it. The church bell rang. We froze. It was a deep, resonant toll that echoed through the empty building. One single note. We stared at each other, wide-eyed. That's not possible, I whispered. The bell tower had collapsed years ago. The bell itself had been taken down and moved to the newer church across town. There was no bell here. We ran, sprinting out the side door. We didn't stop until we were back in Cassie's car, breathing heavily. We sat there in silence, staring at the empty church, waiting to see if someone would come out. Nothing did. Finally, Cassie turned the key, but the car wouldn't start. Just the clicking of the ignition over and over. Then, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the bell rang again. Not a long toll like before. This time, it was a full sequence. 3 slow, deliberate chimes. I turned to Cassie. Didn't you say church bells ring in 3s for funerals? Cassie didn't answer. She just stared ahead, pale as a ghost. I followed her gaze. A church door, the boarded up one, was wide open. Inside, past the doorway, was nothing but blackness. Then the car started. Neither of us spoke as we drove away, and we never went back. The next morning, when we finally got the nerve to talk about it, we both admitted something. During that second ringing of the bell, we had each heard a whisper, not the air, right behind us, and it had said the same thing. Come inside. We didn't sleep that night. Even after we left the church behind, the weight of that voice followed us. I remember lying in my bed, the covers pulled up to my chin, staring at my closed bedroom door, half expecting it to swing open on its own. The next morning, Cassie called me. Meet me at the diner, she said. Her voice was flat, but I could tell she hadn't slept either. When I got there, she already had a cup of coffee in front of her, untouched. She looked worse than I felt. Her eyes were red, and her hands were wrapped around the mug like she was trying to warm herself. I had a dream, she said before I could even sit down. I didn't say anything, just waited. She swallowed. I was in the church, but it wasn't empty. The pews were full, but the people, she shook her head. They weren't moving, just sitting there, staring straight ahead, and they were all burnt, like statues made of ash. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. There was something at the altar, she continued. It was standing where the priest would be, but it wasn't a priest. I leaned in. What was it? She shook her head. I don't know. He was covered in a long, black robe. It didn't have a face. Just this void where a head should be. I swallowed hard. Then she looked at me, and her voice was barely a whisper. It rang the bell. We sat in silence for a long time. Finally, I asked, what happened after that? She hesitated, then pulled out her phone. I woke up at exactly 3:33 again, but then I checked my photos. I frowned. Photos. She nodded and handed me the phone. I felt my stomach drop. There, in her camera roll, was a picture of the church. The same church we'd been in, taken from the outside, only we hadn't taken any pictures. And the church door, it was still wide open. We both agreed we needed to know more. Cassie's grandmother had lived in town her whole life, so we decided to ask her if she knew anything about the church's history. We expected old stories, maybe some folklore. What we got was worse. When we showed her the picture, she turned white. You girls didn't go there, did you? She asked, voice shaking. We didn't answer. We didn't have to. She exhaled slowly, pressing a hand to her chest. That place should have been torn down years ago, she muttered. Should have burned with the rest of them. I felt my blood ring cold. The rest of what? I asked. Her eyes flicked to mine, and for a second, I saw real fear in them. The congregation. Cassie and I exchanged glances. What happened? She asked. Her grandmother hesitated, like she wasn't sure she wanted to say it out loud. But then she did. There was a fire, she said, a long time ago, during a late night service. No one made it out. People said it was an accident, but she trailed off, staring at the picture again. The what? I asked. She swallowed. They said the priest did it, that he locked the doors himself, that she closed her eyes, like she was trying to push the thought away. He wasn't himself, near the end. He started talking about things that weren't in the Bible, about someone else, something else, said they were coming, that we had to listen, that we had to let them in. Cassie and I sat frozen. People stopped going. Her grandmother whispered, so one night, he gathered the ones who were left. He locked the doors. The room felt suddenly unbearably cold. What was his name? I asked. Her grandmother looked up at me, and I swear, I almost didn't want to hear the answer. What she said it, and my stomach dropped, because it was the same name Cassie had heard in her dream. The name the whisper had spoken. The name we both had heard when the bell rang for the last time. The name that was carved into the altar in the abandoned church. Father Elias Ashford, the man who had burned with his congregation, the man who was supposed to be dead. Cassie and I left her grandmother's house in a daze. Neither of us spoke on the drive back, but I could tell she was thinking the same thing I was. The church wasn't empty. That priest, Father Elias Ashford, had died with his congregation in the fire, but something was still there, something that had spoken to us, called to us, come inside, and we should have left it alone. Any sane person would have, but something about him, felt unfinished. That night, I stayed up, scrolling through old articles about the fire. There wasn't much, just a few local records. The fire had been ruled an accident, though the details were vague. And then I found something, a grainy black and white photo of the church before the fire. The congregation stood outside, smiling, and there, in the center, was Father Ashford, hollow eyes staring directly into the camera. His face was wrong, even in the old photograph, like it had been stretched too thin, like it barely belonged to him. My stomach twisted. At the bottom of the article, in tiny faded print, was a detail that hadn't been mentioned before. The fire started at exactly 3:33 a.m. I slammed my laptop shut. That's when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Cassie. It's happening again. I called her immediately. She answered on the first ring, her breathing ragged. I can hear it. She whispered, the bell. I asked. She didn't answer right away. Then, though, the voice. Cassie, where are you? Hi. I don't know, she whispered. I don't remember falling asleep, but I just woke up and her voice broke. I'm outside the church. I shot up. What? I don't know how I got here. Her voice was shaking. I woke up in my car, and it's parked right in front of the church. I was already grabbing my keys. Stay in the car. I told her, I'm coming. She let out a shaky breath. Hurry. By the time I got there, the sky was an inky black. The town was quiet. Too quiet. Cassie's car was parked on the side of the road, headlights on. She was was still inside, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. I knocked on the window. She jumped, then immediately unlocked the doors. "You okay?" I asked. She just pointed. I turned. The church door was open, and this time, it wasn't just open, it was waiting. The darkness inside was deeper than it should have been, stretching past the threshold like an open mouth. The air was heavy, charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm. "Cassie, we need to go." She didn't respond. I turned back to her, and my stomach dropped. She wasn't looking at me, she was staring past me. I followed her gaze. At the doorway, just inside the church, something moved. A tall, robed figure stood at the altar. I knew who it was before I even saw his face. Except, there was no face, just a void, a black hollow where a head should be. The bells rang 3 times. Cassie gasped, her breath catching in her throat. "Hi," and then the whisper came, not from the church, not from the bell tower, not from behind us, from inside the car. "Come inside." I didn't think. I just grabbed Cassie's arm and yanked her out of the car. The moment she stepped out, the church door slammed shut. The whisper cut off. The bells went silent. For a long moment, we just stood there, staring at the church, at the now closed door. Then Cassie turned to me, her eyes wide, her voice barely a breath. I think I almost went in. We didn't talk about it again. Not really. We left the church that night and swore we'd never go back. Cassie moved away a few months later. I stayed in town, but I never so much as drove near that road again. And for a while, nothing happened. Then, last week, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer. I wish I hadn't, because when I picked up, the line was silent at first. Then I heard it, the bell, 3 chimes. I needed a short-term rental and found a small guest house listed on a local site. It was cheap, fully furnished, and only available for a month, perfect for my needs. The owner, an older woman named Carol, met me with the keys, gave me a quick tour, and warned me about one thing: that mirror in the hallway. Don't move it, just leave it be. I laughed, assuming it was an old family heirloom or something. Carol didn't laugh back. The mirror was a full-length, antique thing, slightly warped in its reflection. It stood at the end of the narrow hallway, facing the bedroom door. I wasn't particularly superstitious, so I didn't think much of it. The first night was uneventful, but on the second night, I was woken by a loud thud. It came from the hallway. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, expecting to see that the mirror had somehow fallen. But no, it was exactly where it had been. I convinced myself I'd imagined it and went back to bed. On the third night, I started noticing something off about my reflection, not in a dramatic horror movie way, just small things. The way it stood, the way its hands lingered by its sides a second too long after I moved. I told myself it was just the warping of the glass. That night, I woke up again, this time to a soft shuffling sound. I grabbed my phone and stepped into the hallway. The mirror had moved, not a lot, just a few inches forward. I felt a rush of cold, like I had stepped into a freezer. I stood there, staring at my reflection, which looked rugged. The hallway was dim, but my reflection's features seemed sharper, like the glass was making them clear rather than obscuring them. I reached out, and my reflection didn't. I bolted back to my room, slammed the door, and didn't sleep until morning. The next day, I called Carol. "That mirror," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did someone move it before?" There was a long silence. "Listen to me carefully." Carol finally said, "You need to leave the house right now." I didn't ask why. I packed my bag in 10 minutes, shoved my stuff into my car, and drove straight to a friend's place. Later that night, Carol texted me, "The mirror isn't supposed to be moved. Not forward, not backward. If it's moving on its own, something inside is trying to step through." A few weeks passed, and I did my best to forget about the mirror. But some things stick with you, no matter how hard you try to move on. For starters, my own reflection never looked the same again. It always felt slightly off. I'd catch myself staring into mirrors for too long, half expecting my reflection to delay a movement, or worse, move when I didn't. Then the dream started. In them, I was always back in that hallway, standing in front of the mirror. But something was different. The glass wasn't just reflecting anymore, it was showing me something. A dark space, like a room without walls. And in that darkness, something was waiting, watching. One night, I had a dream where my reflection finally stepped out, and I didn't wake up right away. I was still in the dream, still standing in the hallway, except now, I wasn't looking at the mirror, I was looking out from inside it. My body, my real body, was walking away. I tried to scream, to move, but I was trapped. I woke up gasping, my heart racing. But here's the worst part. When I stumbled into my bathroom, splashed water on my face, and looked up, there was a handprint on the mirror. Not wide, it was too long, too thin, the fingers stretched almost halfway down the glass. I didn't sleep sleep after that. I stayed up all night with the lights on, watching my reflection, making sure it wasn't watching me back. The next morning, I made a decision. I needed answers. I drove back to the guest house. It was still empty, just like Carol had said. The front door was locked, but I knew another way in. The sliding back door never latched properly. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt wrong, heavy, like the house was holding its breath. The mirror was still there at the end of the hallway, but something was different. The glass was dark, as if the hallway lights didn't touch it anymore, like the surface had deepened, stretching into that endless blackness from my dream. And then I saw it, a figure, tall, thin, not quite human, standing just behind the glass. It didn't move, but I felt it staring at me. Waited. I don't remember running out, but suddenly I was outside, gasping for breath. Carol was waiting on the porch. She didn't seem surprised to see me. "You shouldn't have come back," she said. I demanded to know what was going on. She hesitated, then sighed. "That mirror doesn't show reflections," she finally said. "It shows replacements, and sometimes they get impatient." A few months passed, and I did my best to move on. I stopped thinking about the mirror, about the thing inside it. I convinced myself it was just a bad dream, a trick of the light, a mix of stress and paranoia. But then my reflection blinked when I didn't. It happened in a gas station bathroom. I was washing my hands, exhausted from a long day, when I caught it, just for a second. My reflection blinked, but I hadn't. I froze, heart hammering. I stared at myself, willing it to happen again. Nothing. I forced a laugh, chalking it up to sleep deprivation. But when I turned to grab a paper towel, my reflection stayed still for just a fraction of a second too long. I bolted out of the bathroom. That night, I covered every mirror in my apartment with sheets and blankets. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Then the dreams came back. This time, I wasn't just trapped inside the mirror. I was being pushed deeper. At first, it was just a few steps. The darkness surrounded me, stretching in all directions. But each night, I was dragged further in. One night, I finally saw where it was leading me. In the blackness, there were others. Figures, pale, silent, reflections that had been taken. They stared at me, their faces warped and hollow. Some had mouths twisted into frozen screams. Others were missing pieces, eyes, hands, half their faces blurred like smeared glass. And at the center of them all was the thing from the mirror. It was taller than I remembered. Its arms were too long, its fingers too thin. It had no face, just a smooth, reflective surface where its features should have been. They reached for me. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. I knew I couldn't stay in my apartment. I packed a bag and drove. I didn't have a plan. I just needed to get away. But you can't run from a reflection. At a motel, I caught another glimpse. In the old, dusty mirror above the dresser, my reflection was smiling. I wasn't. I grabbed my keys and ran. By now, I had one name in my phone, Carol. I didn't know if she could help, but she was the only person who seemed to understand what was happening. I called her at 2 a.m., half expecting her not to pick up, but she did. "You let it follow you, didn't you?" I could barely speak. I asked her what to do, how to stop it. She sighed. "You have to break the mirror." I was already in my car, speeding back to my apartment. "Not just any mirror," she warned. "The first one, the one that started this." I slammed on the brakes. The mirror in the guest house. I didn't want to go back. Every part of me screamed not to go back, but I didn't have a choice. By the time I reached the guest house, dawn was creeping over the horizon. The house looked even more abandoned than before. The air was thick and wrong, like it was waiting for me. The mirror was still there, but this time, I wasn't alone. There was something on the other side. Its hands were pressed against the glass. Its face, or what was left of it, was stretched into something almost human, almost me. It whispered in a voice that sounded too much like mine. "Let me in." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a rusted fireplace poker, and swung. The glass shattered, the pieces not falling, but pulling inward like the mirror was trying to suck them back. A horrible, screeching sound filled the hallway, something between glass breaking and a voice screaming underwater. Then silence. The air felt lighter. The weight was gone. I didn't wait around to see what happened next. I left town the next day, moved across the state. Haven't seen Carol since. Haven't had the dreams. This happened when I was 16. I had been babysitting for a family I'll call the Parkers for about 6 months. They had 2 little boys, Charlie and Ben, and were the sweetest kids I had ever watched. Their parents always paid well and left clear instructions, so it was a dream babysitting gig. One Friday night, they asked me to stay later than usual, past midnight, since they were going to a friend's birthday party. I said yes, figuring I'd put the kids to bed by 9 p.m. and just watch TV until they got home. At 8:30, I started the bedtime routine. Charlie and Ben were a little hyper, so so I read them 2 stories instead of 1. By 9:15, they were finally out, and I crept downstairs to clean up the toys scattered across the living room. That's when I heard something, a soft giggle. It wasn't the boys. I had just tucked them in, and their room was at the end of the upstairs hall. This laugh sounded like it was right behind me. I turned around quickly, expecting to see one of them sneaking back downstairs, but the living room was empty. Still, I felt weirdly embarrassed, like I had been caught off guard by someone I couldn't see. Shaking it off, I settled onto the couch and scrolled through my phone. Everything was normal for about an hour. Then, at exactly 10:30 p.m., I heard soft footsteps upstairs. Not running, just walking. I sighed, assuming one of the boys had gotten up for water and went to check. I peeked into their room. They were both sound asleep. Now I was getting freaked out. The footsteps had definitely sounded like they were coming from upstairs. I hesitated in the hall for a second, listening. Silence. Then, softly, just behind me, a whisper. Where are the others? I spun around so fast I almost tripped. No one was there, but the air felt thick, like someone had just been standing inches from my back. I bolted downstairs, heart racing. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just being paranoid. But as I reached the couch, I noticed something that nearly made me scream. The baby monitor, the one I had left upstairs, was now sitting on the kitchen counter. I hadn't brought it down. I knew I hadn't. My hands were shaking as I grabbed it, checking the screen. The night vision showed Charlie and Ben in their beds. They hadn't moved. Then, right before my eyes, the camera tilted. Not a glitch, not a slow shift. Something moved it. It panned away from the beds and pointed at the closet. The closet door was open. I didn't even grab my things. I just ran outside and called Mrs. Parker in a panic. She and her husband rushed home, and when they arrived, they checked the whole house. Nothing was out of place. The boys were still asleep. I tried to explain what had happened, but I could tell they thought I was just a scared teenager with an overactive imagination. Still, they thanked me and sent me home. The next day, Mrs. Parker texted me, "Hey, I forgot to mention, when we first moved in, Ben used to talk about the other kids in the house. He said they liked to play with his toys at night. We figured it was just his imagination, but maybe we should have listened. Let me know if you ever want to babysit again." I never replied to Mrs. Parker's text. I didn't even know what to say. Instead, I blocked the number and tried to put the whole experience out of my mind, but that was easier said than done. For the next few nights, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the baby monitor screen, the way the camera had moved by itself, how it had settled on that open closet. I kept telling myself that it had to be a weird malfunction, that maybe one of the boys had woken up, adjusted the camera, and I just hadn't noticed. That's what I wanted to believe. Then, a week later, something else happened. I was babysitting for another family across town, the Morgans. Their daughter, Sophie, was 6. I had watched her a few times before, and she was easy, just a little chatty. Her bedtime was at 9, so after reading her a story, I turned off her lamp and made sure she was tucked in. As I was closing her door, she mumbled something. At first, I thought she was talking in her sleep, but then she said it again, more clearly. "Are the other kids coming tonight?" I froze. It felt like my stomach dropped straight to the floor. I turned back toward her, keeping my voice calm. "What did you say, sweetheart?" She rubbed her eyes sleepily. "The other kids, the ones that play at night." The room suddenly felt colder. I forced a smile. "Oh, I don't think so." Sophie yawned, rolling onto her side. "Okay, maybe tomorrow." Then she fell asleep like nothing was wrong. I left the room quickly, my hands shaking as I grabbed my phone and texted Mrs. Morgan. "Hey, have you ever heard Sophie talk about the other kids before?" She took a few minutes to respond, and when she did, my blood ran cold. "Lol, yeah, all the time, and she has an imaginary friend group. Calls them the others. Kids are so funny." I didn't respond. I sat there on their couch for the next 2 hours, wide awake, listening for every tiny noise, every creak of the house. I kept expecting to hear that soft giggle again, or those slow, deliberate footsteps. Nothing happened that night, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that whatever was in the Parker's house was following me. After that night at the Morgan's house, I decided to take a break from babysitting. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was overthinking things, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. I had this awful feeling that no matter where I went, no matter who I babysat for, I would hear about the other kids, but I didn't say anything to anyone. I didn't want to sound crazy. Then, about 2 weeks later, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Hi, this is Mrs. Parker. I got a new phone. Just wanted to check in and see if you'd be up for babysitting this Friday. The boys miss you." My stomach clenched. I never unblocked her number, and I definitely never gave her my new one. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "I'm really busy with school. Sorry." She replied almost instantly. "That's okay. We just thought you'd want to say hi to the others." I dropped my phone. I sat there, my heart hammering, until the screen timed out. When I I finally picked it up again, I saw the message had been deleted. But before I could process that, my phone buzzed again. A picture, a blurry, dark photo of what looked like a baby monitor screen. I tapped on it with shaking hands, trying to make out the details. It was hard to see, but I could just barely recognize Charlie and Ben's bedroom, the same room where I had heard the footsteps. Only now, something was different. In the center of the screen, just in front of the closet door, was the faint, shadowy outline of 3 small figures, standing still, facing the camera, staring. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to convince myself it was some kind of trick, some kind of messed up joke, but then I noticed something that made my entire body go numb. In the bottom corner of the screen, the baby monitor displayed a timestamp. It was the current date, and the time was leave. A photo wasn't from before. It was happening right now. I don't remember making the decision to run, but suddenly I was up and moving. I bolted downstairs, barely remembering to grab my keys as I rushed out the front door. I didn't care that I was in my pajamas or that it was after midnight. I just needed to get away. I didn't stop until I reached my car. When I finally had the courage to look back at my phone, the message was gone. The picture, the texts, everything had vanished, like it had never been there at all. I never babysat again after that. There was a 24-hour grocery store about 10 minutes from my apartment, and since I worked late shifts, I often went there after midnight to grab food. It was one of those places that always felt a little too quiet at night, but it was familiar. One night, I was exhausted and just wanted something quick for dinner. I drove over around 1:30 a.m. and parked in my usual spot. As I was walking up to the entrance, I noticed something strange. The automatic doors weren't opening. There were lights on inside, but when I stepped closer, I saw a handwritten sign taped to the glass. Store closed for maintenance. Sorry for the inconvenience. I was annoyed but mostly confused. This place was supposed to be open 24/7, and besides, I could see the aisles beyond the glass. The fluorescent lights hummed like always, and nothing looked out of place. Then I noticed the cashier. She was standing behind the counter, looking right at me. I couldn't make out her face clearly because of the glare on the glass, but she was wearing the usual uniform, standing stiffly with her hands flat on the counter. I figured maybe she hadn't seen me, so I knocked on the glass lightly and gestured toward the sign. She didn't react. That's when I noticed something even weirder. The screen at her register was flashing like it was stuck in some kind of loop. Please scan item. Please scan item. Please scan item. But there was no one at the counter. The whole place looked empty aside from her. No other employees. No late night shoppers. Something about it made me feel off. I took a step back, debating whether I should just leave. But then, from the back of the store, someone walked into view. It was another employee, a stalker, pushing a cart down one of the aisles. But the way they were moving was wrong. Their steps were slow and exaggerated, like they were deliberately placing each foot down too hard. Their head was slightly tilted, like they were listening for something, and then they turned their head toward me, just their head, not their body. I don't know why, but that was the moment I felt actual fear. I hurried back to my car and got in, locking the doors. When I looked back at the store, the cashier was still at the counter, still facing me. The stalker had disappeared into another aisle. The sign on the door looked older than before, like the paper had been there for months, curling at the edges. I drove home, telling myself I was just imagining things. Maybe it was a deep clean or some weird training night. The next day, I stopped by in the afternoon. The store was open again, bustling with customers. I went to check out, and as the cashier rang me up, I casually mentioned, "Hey, were you guys closed for maintenance last night?" She looked at me, confused. "No, we've been open all week." I felt a weird chill. "Are you sure?" I came by around 1:30, and there was a sign on the door. The cashier gave a little laugh. "Whoa, the automatic doors act up sometimes, but we were definitely open." I didn't push it, just paid and left. But I knew what I saw. A few weeks passed, and I tried to push the whole thing out of my mind. Maybe I had just been overtired. Maybe I had imagined something that wasn't really there. But every time I drove past that store late at night, I felt uneasy, like something was watching from behind the glass. Then, one night, a friend of mine, Kevin, brought it up. We were hanging out at my place, playing video games, when he suddenly said, "Hey, weird question. Have you ever seen that grocery store closed at night?" My stomach dropped. I put my controller down and looked at it. "Why do you ask?" Kevin shrugged. "I stopped by around 2 a.m. the other night to grab something, but the doors wouldn't open. There was a sign that said they were closed, but I swear, man, I saw people in there, employees, like, just standing around. They didn't even look like they were working." I felt a cold sweat break out on my back. "What did you do?" I asked. Kevin hesitated, then laughed nervously. I left. The whole place just felt rug. He rubbed his arms like he was cold. "Dude, one of the cashiers was standing behind the counter, staring straight ahead. not moving, and I swear, when I backed away, one of the stalkers just walked into the freezer section, like, right into the doors. I didn't even see them open. I felt like I was going to be sick. It wasn't just me. Kevin, I said slowly, when you drove past the next day, was the store open again? He blinked at me. Yep, like nothing happened. Neither of us knew what to say after that. We decided to test something. That night, around 1:45 a.m., we drove over together. The store was bright and hummy with its usual fluorescent glow, but when we got close, the automatic doors didn't open, and there it was, the same sign taped to the glass. We stood there, staring, and inside, beyond the checkout lanes, stood the cashier. It wasn't the same person I had seen before, but that didn't matter. She was standing the exact same way, rigid, hands flat on the counter. Then something happened that hadn't happened the first time. The lights inside flickered, and all at once, every single employee inside turned their heads toward us. Not their bodies, just their heads. Kevin made a strangled noise in his throat. We need to go. No, I didn't argue. We turned and sprinted to the car. As I fumbled with the keys, I risked one last glance at the store. The employees hadn't moved, but the cashier had raised her hand, and she was waving. Not a normal wave, though. Her wrist was limp, her fingers moving too slowly, like she was mimicking something she'd only seen but never done herself. We peeled out of the parking lot, neither of us saying a word until we were miles away. We never went back. A month later, the store shut down permanently. The sign out front just said, "Thank you for your business. Location closed." But the weirdest part, the building was demolished less than a week later. Kevin and I tried to forget what happened. We told ourselves we were just sleep deprived, our minds playing tricks on us. But deep down, we both knew the truth. Something wasn't right about that store. For months, I avoided that part of town, and even after they demolished the building, I wouldn't drive past where it used to be. I figured whatever was there, whoever was watching us, was gone. I was wrong. One night, about 6 months later, I got a text from Kevin. "Kevin, dude, do not go near the old grocery store." I frowned. It was late, almost 2 a.m. I hadn't even been thinking about that place, but now my skin was crawling. "Lee, why? What happened?" "Kevin, I just drove past. There's something there." I sat up in bed, my heart racing. "Lee, something like what?" Kevin didn't respond for a long time. Then, finally, "Kevin, lights." I stared at my phone. "Lee, we made construction." "Kevin, no. The lights are inside." That made no sense. The building was gone. I had seen it with my own eyes, just an empty lot now, surrounded by chain link fencing. Kevin sent another text. "Kevin, I stopped for a second to look. I swear to God, man, the automatic doors, they were there, and they almost opened. That was enough for me." I called him, and he picked up immediately. He was breathing fast. "I'm parked a block away," he said. "I don't think I should drive past again. Get out of there," I told him, but Kevin didn't respond right away. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I think something saw me." The cold, awful silence filled the call. "Kevin," the lights flickered. He whispered, like before. And then, I don't know how to explain this, but I felt like something was coming to the door. I felt like I was going to throw up. "Where are you now?" I asked. "Pulled into a gas station." Tried to breathe. Then, I swear, for a second, I could see the aisles. Like the store was still there. And I think I saw. He trailed off. I swallowed hard. "What did you say?" Kevin let out a shaky breath. A cashier, standing behind the counter. That was it. I told Kevin to drive straight to my place. He stayed the night, but we barely slept. Neither of us wanted to risk looking out the window. The next day, in broad daylight, we went back to check. It was just an empty lot. No lights, no doors, just overgrown weeds and an old fence with a property for sale sign. But something was wrong. In the dirt, where the entrance had been, we saw footprints. A single set leading out of the lot, but there were no footprints leading in. That was the last time Kevin and I ever talked about it. He moved to another city a few months later, and I don't blame him. But sometimes, late at night, when I drive alone, I think about that store. I had just moved to a new city for work, and I didn't know anyone yet. It was lonely, but I liked the quiet. One night, around 2 a.m., my phone rang. I was half asleep, but I answered out of instinct. "Hello." For a second, there was just silence. Then, my own voice echoed back at me. "Hello." Not like a delay or a bad connection. It was perfectly synced. My exact tone, my breathing. It was like listening to a recording of myself answering the phone. I hung up immediately. I stared at my screen, heart pounding. The call had come from a number that wasn't listed, just a blank space. No digits, no unknown caller, just nothing. I tried to shake it off as some weird prank or a tech glitch, but a deep unease settled in my chest. The next night, it happened again. Same blank number, same exact echo of my voice. This time, I didn't hang up right away. I waited, listening to my breathing repeat back at me. But then, something changed. I spoke softly, "Who is this?" And my voice replied, "Who is this?" I swallowed hard. "Stop this." It paused. Then my voice, distorted now, said, "You don't belong here." I slammed the phone down. I barely slept that night. I checked my call logs the next morning. The number wasn't listed, like the calls had never happened, but it wasn't over. The third night, I didn't answer, but they left a voicemail. My stomach turned as I pressed play. It was just breathing. My breathing, a perfect match. Then, right before it ended, a whisper, low, guttural, and rom. Don't make me come find you. A few years passed, and I convinced myself that it had just been some bizarre tech glitch, a prank with some kind of voice mimicking software. But even then, I never truly believed it. Deep down, something about those calls felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I was fine for a while. Then, about 3 months ago, it happened again. Same time, 2 a.m. I had moved to an entirely different city. New number, new job, new life. But when I saw my phone light up, my stomach dropped. The caller ID, blank. I stared at the screen, frozen. My fingers felt numb as I answered. Hello. Silence. Then, hello. My voice, perfectly synced. I nearly dropped my phone. My mind was racing. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening again. I took a slow breath and whispered, "What do you want?" For a few seconds, it was just breathing. Light breathing. Then the voice, my own, spoke back. "Why did you leave?" I felt something cold run through me. "What do you mean?" I whispered. A pause. Then a new sound. Not an echo. Not a copy of me. Something else. The voice distorted, stretching, twisting, until it was something just close enough to human but not quite right. "You left me behind." I hung up. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. Then, a week later, I woke up to my phone ringing again. I didn't answer. I let it go to voicemail, but when I checked it in the morning, there was no new message. The notification was there, the little red bubble on my screen, but when I tapped it, my voicemail was empty. I tried to brush it off, but the next morning, another notification. Still nothing there. I stopped checking, but they kept coming every night for weeks. Then, one night, I woke up not to a phone call, but to the sound of something ringing in my apartment. Not my phone. It was coming from inside the closet. My old phone, the one from 5 years ago. I had left it in a box when I moved. The battery was dead. It hadn't been charged in years. But when I pulled it out, the screen was on. One notification. New voicemail. I didn't want to listen. I knew I shouldn't, but I did. It was just breathing. Like breathing. Then, you should have answered. I threw the phone in the trash that night. I smashed it, broke it apart, and dumped the pieces in different dumpsters around the city. I wish I could say that was the end of it. That throwing out the phone solved whatever this was. But I was wrong. It was never about the phone. It was about me. For a while, things were quiet. No calls. No weird voicemail notifications. I started sleeping better. I'd even convinced myself it had all been in my head. Maybe I had just been stressed. Maybe it was some elaborate prank that had finally run its course. Then, 3 nights ago, my phone rang again. 2 a.m. The number was blank. I didn't answer, but this time, it left a voicemail. I stared at my phone for a long time before pressing play. It started with breathing. Then my voice, shaky, quiet, terrified, whispered, "It's too late now." The message ended. I turned off my phone and left it on my nightstand. I wasn't going to deal with this. Not anymore. I just needed to sleep. But sleep never came, because at 2:37 a.m., I heard something else. It wasn't my phone. It was my landline. I had a cheap corded phone in my kitchen, one of those old-fashioned ones with a dial tone. I had never given out the number. I barely even remembered it existed, but it was ringing. Slow, mechanical, shrill. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. It rang again, and again, and again. I couldn't move. My entire body felt frozen, locked in place by some deep-rooted instinct screaming at me not to answer. Then, after the 9th ring, it stopped. Silent. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at my bedroom door, waiting for something to happen, waiting for some proof that this was all in my head. Then, from the kitchen, the sound of the phone being picked up. I nearly choked on my own breath. Someone had answered. Something was on the other line. I heard it breathing, soft, chucked, familiar. Then, my own voice, distorted, warped into something not quite human, spoke. "I'm inside now." The line clicked dead, and then I heard my bedroom door creak open. I don't remember what happened next. I must have blacked out, or maybe my brain just refused to process it. All I know is that I woke up at dawn, the sun spilling through my window. My phone was still on the nightstand. The landline was back on the receiver. Everything looked normal, but it wasn't, because I wasn't in my bed anymore. I was sitting in the chair by the window, my back stiff, my hands folded in my lap, like I had been watching something all night, or waiting. I don't remember moving there. I don't remember anything after the call, but there's one thing I know for sure. When I looked at my phone that morning, I had one last voicemail. I grew up in a small town, the kind where the biggest event of the year was the county fair, and everybody knew everybody. Our house was old, one of those early 1900 seconds farmhouses with creaky wooden floors and a basement that smelled like damp earth. One summer, we had a particularly bad thunderstorm. It knocked the power out for most of the night. My parents lit some candles in the living room and told me and my younger brother, Tommy, to stay put while they went to check on the generator in the garage. Being kids, we got bored fast. Tommy was only 6 and already falling asleep, but I was wide awake. I grabbed the flashlight and wandered into the den where the big, boxy TV sat. I knew it wouldn't work, but I turned it on anyway. The screen flickered and static. I don't know why I stayed there, just watching it. Maybe it was the way the shadows from the candlelight danced on the walls, or maybe I was just waiting for the power to come back. But then, the static changed. It wasn't just white noise anymore. Shapes were forming. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then, through the static, I saw her. A girl, maybe my age or a little older. She stood still, just barely distinguishable through the shifting black and white fuzz. I thought it was some weird old broadcast being picked up, like those emergency test signals. But the girl turned her head, and I swear she looked right at me. My whole body went cold. She opened her mouth, but I couldn't hear anything. The static grew louder, like it was filling the entire room. Then, just as suddenly as she appeared, the screen snapped back to normal white noise. I turned off the TV and ran to my brother, shaking him awake. My parents came back inside a few minutes later, saying the generator was fried and we'd have to wait until morning for the power to be restored. I didn't tell them about the girl. I barely slept that night. When the power came back the next day, everything seemed fine until I walked past the den and saw the TV was on. I know for a fact I'd turned it off. After that night, I avoided the TV. Every time I walked past the den, I felt like something was watching me from the screen, just waiting for me to turn it on again. But I didn't. For a while, nothing happened. No weird static, no messages. I almost convinced myself that I imagined it. Almost. Then, one evening about 2 weeks later, Tommy came running into my room, crying. "She's in the TV," he sobbed, clutching his stuffed bear. My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" He sniffled. "The girl. She said my name." I didn't want to believe him. I really didn't. But when I followed him to the den, the TV was already on, static filling the screen. I didn't touch the remote. I didn't turn it off. And then, just like before, the static shifted. The girl was there again, but this time, I could see her more clearly. Her hair was long and tangled, like she'd been running through a forest. Her face was pale, and her eyes, too wide, too dark, locked onto mine. Tommy grabbed my hand, turned it off, he whispered, but I couldn't move. The girl tilted her head, and the static warped around her. Her mouth opened, and this time, I heard something, a faint, crackling voice beneath the white noise. "Help me." I lunged for the remote, hitting the power button so hard I nearly knocked the TV over. The screen went black. For a second, everything was quiet. Then the power cut out again. The house went dark, and I heard Tommy gasp. I fumbled for the flashlight on the shelf, clicking it on. The beam wavered, my hands shaking. That's when I heard the whisper, not from the TV, from behind us. "You see me now." I turned so fast I nearly tripped. The beam of the flashlight swept over the empty den. Nothing was there, but the TV, it was on again. The screen was still black, but in the reflection, I swear I saw her, standing right behind us. We ran out of the den, slamming the door behind us. That was the last time we saw her. A week later, my parents got rid of the old TV, said it was broken, probably from the power surges. They bought a new one, a flat screen. For a long time, I refused to turn it on. Years passed. I grew up, moved out, and tried to forget about the girl in the static. I told myself it was just a childhood nightmare, a weird trick of the brain. Tommy never mentioned it again, and we silently agreed not to bring it up. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I'd wake up and swear I heard it, that faint, crackling hum. I tried to ignore it, until a few months ago, I was back in town visiting my parents. They had remodeled the house, but the den was still there, though it was used more as a storage room now. The old TV was long gone, replaced with a sleek new one that sat unused beneath a dust-covered shelf. One night, after my parents had gone to bed, I wandered downstairs to get some water. As I passed the den, something made me stop. The door was slightly open. I don't know why I pushed it open further. Maybe I was proving something to myself. Maybe I was just stupid. But when I did, the TV was on. I froze. The screen was nothing but static. I backed away slowly, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I wasn't doing this again. I wasn't a scared kid anymore. But then, the static shifted. At first, I thought I was imagining it, just like before. But no, there she was. The girl. Only this time, she looked different. Closer. Her face was clear. Her features sharper. Her dark eyes bore into mine. I reached for the remote, but I couldn't find it. My fingers fumbled over the coffee table, knocking over a stack of magazines. The girl opened her mouth. The whisper came again, but clearer this time. "He let me go." I didn't know what she meant. I didn't care. I bolted for the power button, slamming my palm against it. The screen went black. I stood there, breathing breathing heavily, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then, in the reflection of the dark screen, I saw it. She was standing in the room with me. I read. I don't remember getting back to my bedroom, only that I locked the door behind me and sat in the dark for what felt like hours. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I told my parents that something was wrong with the TV. My dad shrugged it off, said it was probably a loose cable. I didn't argue, but I did one last thing before I left. I went back to the den, TV off, and stood there in the silence. Then I whispered, "What do you want?" For a moment, nothing happened, and then a faint buzz filled the air, not from the TV, but from the old radio on the shelf. It clicked on by itself, its dial shifting erratically, and through the static, I heard it, 5-8. The place wasn't great. Thin walls, flickering lights in the hallway, the kind of place where you learn to sleep through your neighbor's arguments. But it was cheap, and that was all that mattered. One night, I got home from a late shift at my job and went straight to bed. Everything seemed normal. I locked the door, threw my bag on the table, and crashed. At around 3 a.m., I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The apartment was silent, but something felt wrong. That heavy, oppressive feeling like someone's watching you. Still groggy, I sat up and looked around. My apartment had one door leading to the hallway, a small kitchen, and a single window that overlooked the alley. Nothing seemed out of place. Then I turned my head toward the far corner of my living room and saw a door. It wasn't there before. I mean, I lived in this apartment for nearly a year. I knew my layout. There had never been a door there. But now, in the dim glow of my bedside lamp, I could see it clear as day. A plain, gray door, slightly ajar. I sat frozen for what felt like an eternity, my heart hammering. My first thought was that I was dreaming, but I wasn't. I could feel the cold air coming from that doorway. I could smell something too damp, like an old basement. I should have left. I should have run. But curiosity won out. Slowly, I got up, grabbed my phone, and tiptoed toward the door. The closer I got, the more I felt this growing unease, like my body knew something my mind refused to process. I reached out and pushed the door open. The room beyond was rugged. It was a long, narrow hallway that stretched much further than the physical limits of my apartment should allow. The walls were dark, the floor was wooden and scuffed, and there was a low, humming sound like distant machinery. At the very end of the hallway, just barely visible in the darkness, was another door. A voice in my head was screaming at me to stop, but my feet moved forward on their own. I stepped inside. The second I crossed the threshold, I felt the temperature drop. I could see my breath fog in the air. The hallway felt alive, like it was breathing around me. I took another step. The humming sound got louder. Another step. The walls seemed closer now, like they were leading in. Another step, and something moved at the end of the hall. I didn't get a good look at it. I didn't want to. All I saw was a shape, tall and thin, unfolding itself in the darkness. A shape that shouldn't be there. I read it. I spun and bolted back through the door, slamming it shut behind me. My entire apartment shook. The lights flickered violently, and for one horrible second, I thought the door wouldn't stay shut. I could feel something pressing against it from the other side. Then, silence. I stood there, panting, my hands still pressed against the door. Slowly, I backed away, and then, right in front of me, I watched as the door faded. Not slammed shut, not disappeared, faded, like a glitchy image on a screen, flickering in and out until it was gone. By the time the sun came up, the wall was just a wall again. No seam, no outline, no sign that a door had ever been there. I moved out 2 weeks later. I never told my landlord, never asked any of my neighbors if they'd ever seen anything strange. I didn't want to know. I thought leaving the apartment would end it. That movie to a different place, a different city even, would put the whole thing behind me. It didn't. At first, I chalked it up to anxiety. After all, who wouldn't be shaken by something like that? The first few nights in my new apartment, I barely slept. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, expecting to see that door waiting for me in the corner. It never was. Not at first. A month passed, then 2. I started to feel normal again. I convinced myself that what I'd seen was some kind of stress-induced hallucination, maybe even sleep paralysis. I forced myself to forget, and then one night, it came back. I had fallen asleep on my couch, the TV flickering quietly in the background. When I woke up, the room was dark, except for the faint blue glow coming from the far corner. I didn't want to look. I already knew what I'd see, but I had to. The door was back, not in the same place as before, not in a wall where it logically could be. No, this time, it was standing free in the middle of the room. A door with no frame, no supports, just standing there. And it was open. The hallway beyond was darker this time, longer. The air that seeped out was ice cold, carrying that same damp basement smell. I stood up, moving slowly, my breath shallow. My body screamed at me to run, to burn this place to the ground if I had to, but my legs wouldn't listen. listen. I took a step forward, and then the lights flickered. For a fraction of a second, I saw something standing just inside the doorway. A figure, too tall, too thin, its head bent at an unnatural angle. The light came back, and it was gone. The door was still there, but the figure had vanished. That was enough for me. I grabbed my keys and ran out of my apartment, into the hallway, not stopping until I was outside, breathing hard in the cold night air. I didn't go back inside until morning, and when I did, the door was gone again, but this time, I knew better. It wasn't gone, it was waiting. After that night, I stopped sleeping in the dark. Every lamp, every TV, every possible source of light stayed on at all times. I started writing down rules for myself. I don't know why, it just felt necessary, maybe to convince myself I still had some control over this. Rule number 1, never acknowledge the door. If it appears, pretend you don't see it. Rule number 2, if you wake up to find it open, leave the apartment immediately. Rule number 3, never, under any circumstances, step inside. I kept those rules for almost a year. The door still showed up, sometimes once a month, sometimes twice in the same week, but as long as I followed my own rules, it never got worse. Until last night, I woke up at exactly 3:33 a.m. to the sound of knocking. Not from my front door, not from the window, from inside the apartment. I knew, before even looking, what it was. The door, and this time, something was knocking from the other side. Slow, deliberate. 3 knocks. I stayed frozen in bed, clutching the blanket, forcing myself to breathe as quietly as possible. Then 3 more knocks. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just lay there, listening, praying that whatever was on the other side would go away. Then, for the first time in all these years, I heard a voice, muffled, warped, like someone speaking underwater. Let me in. I shut my eyes. Another knock. I said you. I didn't move, didn't breathe, and then suddenly the knocking stopped. For a long, horrible moment, there was silence. Then my bedroom door creaked open, and something stepped inside. I don't remember what happened next. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sun was up. The apartment was normal, no extra door. But when I got up and walked to my bedroom door, I noticed something. There were 3 long scratches on the wood, like something had dragged its fingers down it while watching me sleep. I didn't sleep that night, or the next one. I couldn't. Not after what happened. Every noise in my apartment made my skin crawl. Every flicker of a shadow set my heart racing. I kept every light on, every TV playing some meaningless background noise. But none of it helped. I could feel it. Even when I couldn't see the door, I could feel it watching me. And then, on the 3rd night, it came back. I was sitting on my couch, phone clutched in my hands, debating whether to book a hotel. I hadn't seen the door since the night of the knocking, but I knew it was just a matter of time. Then, the power went out. The apartment was swallowed in darkness. My stomach dropped. I fumbled for my phone flashlight, but before I could turn it on, I heard a whisper. Right next to my you. A breathy, raspy voice. Not human. You're not supposed to be here. I screamed. I don't even remember standing up, but suddenly I was running for the front door, slamming into it, fumbling with the lock, and then everything snapped back to normal. The lights flickered back on, and the apartment was silent. I was standing in front of my couch, not the door, like I had never moved at all. That was it. That was my breaking point. I grabbed my keys and bolted out of there, spent the night in my car, and by morning, I was calling my landlord, telling him I was breaking the lease. I didn't care about the fees. I started packing that same day. While shoving things into boxes, I knocked over a pile of old mail I hadn't sorted through. Annoyed, I scooped it up and froze. There was an envelope I didn't recognize. No return address, no postage, just my name written in spidery, uneven handwriting. My hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. In 4 words, you opened the door. I left that night. I didn't care about getting my deposit back. Didn't care if I left half my stuff behind. I just needed to be gone. As I drove away, I told myself this was it. It was over. I was wrong. I moved across the country. New city, new job, new everything. For months, nothing happened. No doors, no whispers, no signs that it had followed me. I started sleepy with the lights off again. I started feeling normal. And then last night, at exactly 3:33 a.m., I woke up, not because of a noise, not because of a feeling, but because the room was cold. I turned over in bed, disoriented, and that's when I saw it. Not a door, not a whisper, but my closet, slightly ajar, and from the darkness inside, I swear, I saw something move, something waiting, something that never left me after all. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.